Section 11 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 7. Health, Disease and Sanitation, Part 1. When I mentioned to a friend that I intended to devote one of the chapters of this book to the consideration of sanitation in the Middle Ages, he hinted that, as there was no such thing, this would partake somewhat of the character of the famous chapter on snakes in the history of Ireland. In this opinion, I hope to prove that he is wrong. There are many conflicting accounts of the general sanitary condition of a walled town in the Middle Ages. But although some have painted the condition of early London in a very unfavourable light, there is sufficient evidence on the other side to induce us, in taking a general survey of so large a subject, to be careful not to use too dark colours for our picture. Probably the town was healthier in ordinary times than in the country, because the regulations were stricter, but in time of pestilence it was doubtless worse, from the confined space and the want of fresh air caused by the closeness of buildings. We do not hear much of the health of London between the periods of pestilence, but occasional information shows how great was the mortality among infants. The vast disproportion between the births and deaths made the influx of immigrants from the country necessary to keep up the population. As a sign that the general conditions of life were unhealthier then than now, we may note that the expectancy of life in the Middle Ages was much shorter than at present. It is said that as large a number of persons died at 40 years of age as now live to 70. Queen Elizabeth was the first of the 23 sovereigns of England after the Conquest who attained the age of 70, although Edward I indeed lived to his 69th year. Dr. Jessup gives a vivid picture of the frightful condition of town populations. He writes, quote, "The sediment of the town population in the Middle Ages was a dense slough of stagnant misery, squalor, famine, loathsome disease, and dull despair, such as the worst slums of London, Paris, or Liverpool know nothing of." End quote. Dr. Charles Creighton, in his monumental work on epidemics, takes the view that we must receive with some skepticism the extremely unsatisfactory accounts of the conditions of old London. He points out that, while Erasmus gives a most repulsive description of the state of the houses, his contemporary and friend, Sir Thomas More, takes a much more flattering view. Dr. Creighton says, quote, "Some part of the rather unfair opinion as to the foulness of English life in former times may be traced to a well-known letter by Erasmus to the physician of Cardinal Wolsey. There are grounds for believing that Erasmus must have judged from somewhat unfavourable instances." End quote. Dr. Creighton further points out that William Harrison, Description of England, gives proof enough that the filthy floors described by Erasmus had no existence 2 generations later, even among the poorer classes. Fitzstephen was quite satisfied with the salubrity of the city, and he becomes enthusiastic over the gardens and clear springs which abounded on all sides, and made the walks of those who took the air in the summer evenings so agreeable. In fine, he says, quote, "The city is delightful, indeed, when it has a good governor." End quote. Sir Thomas More, at a later period, saw so little amiss that he was content to consider London as a fair sample of what he would wish the capital of Utopia to be. We know, at all events, that whatever its faults, it was in advance of foreign cities. It has been said that the English word comfort cannot be translated, and a curious confirmation of this is found in the fact that in the old French contemporary account of Wat Tyler's rebellion, the word is introduced in a French context, as if there was no equivalent in that language. Dr. J. W. Tripe in 1881 took as the subject of his inaugural address on assuming the presidential chair of the Society of Medical Officers of Health, the sanitary condition and laws of medieval England. Referring to this, a writer in the Medical Times and Gazette says, quote, "His description of the streets and houses of old London, and of the habits of our forefathers, though most graphic, was not new. But few, we think, have any idea of the antiquity of sanitary, nuisance removal, and river conservancy acts, and Dr. Tripe has therefore done well to again set forth the accounts of them that have been exhumed from the records of the city. Rude as they may seem to modern notions, they ought to have sufficed for the prevention of the epidemics which, from time to time, decimated the population, if they had not, like so many more recent enactments, been in advance of the age, and consequently remained for the most part dead letters." End quote. Before entering into particulars as to means taken for the protection of the city from disease, and as to those upon whom the duty was laid of carrying them out, it will be necessary to make a few remarks upon the healing art in the Middle Ages. It may be presumed that at all times large numbers suffered from illness and required medical aid, yet none has come down to us relating to the treatment adopted by the doctors. Unfortunately, the medical men of the Middle Ages do not appear to have trusted to themselves or to their own practical knowledge. Instead, they put their whole trust in the little they knew of Greek practice which they learnt from the Arabs, so that, even when writing on cases that came under their own observation, they give but slight information respecting the clinical treatment they adopted, and were afraid to express an opinion without the authority of a great name. Dr. Norman Moore says, quote, "The basis of medicine is the patient." End quote. This being so, as the patient always exists, the medicine man must always have been required. Those whose duty it was to combat disease among the Saxons seem to have been of little account, if we are to judge from the Reverend Oswald Cockaine's collection of leechdoms, wort cunning, and starcraft of early England, published in the Master of the Rolls series, 1864, and Dr. J. F. Payne's Fitzpatrick Lectures on the History of Medicine, 1903. The Saxon leech received a professional education, and was often learned, although he did not advance knowledge. He seems to have placed more reliance upon charms and magic than upon any sensible treatment. He compounded recipes of the most incongruous character, and paid special attention to the use of herbs, but few instances of cures performed by him are recorded. It is not until after the Conquest that we are able to find the first signs of the noble profession of today. It is said that medieval medicine first began to emerge from obscurity in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Jews and the clergy were among the first to practice medicine. A noted Jewish physician is recorded by William of Newburgh as practicing at King's Lynn at the end of the 12th century, but shortly afterwards the Jews were driven out of the country, and we hear no more of them except of an occasional physician who managed to escape the general outlawry of his nation. The clergy also, in course of time, largely gave over their noble attempts to heal their fellow citizens, and a medical profession was gradually formed. John of Salisbury died 1180, the friend and counsellor of Thomas à Becket, who is called by Bishop Stubbs, quote, "the central figure of English learning for 30 years," end quote, and may therefore be considered to some extent as an authority on the subject, had a very poor opinion of the medical profession of his day, and rated its members roundly for their ignorance and incompetence. He affirmed that they had two maxims which they never violated. Quote, "Never mind the poor, never refuse money from the rich." End quote. There was no school of anatomy or surgery throughout England in the age of Chaucer and Wycliffe, but the medical schools of Salerno, Naples, and Montpellier were attended by Englishmen. St. Luke is usually considered as the patron saint of the medical profession, but in the Middle Ages he was to a great extent dispossessed by St. Cosmas and St. Damian, two brothers who practiced as physicians in Cilicia and were martyred in the early part of the 4th century. These were the patron saints of the Company of Barber Surgeons, but the Fellowship of Surgeons, whose history has been written by Mr. Darcy Power, kept St. Luke's day as well as that of St. Cosmas and St. Damian. Chaucer found room for the Doctor of Physic in his wonderful gallery of medieval portraits, and a very vivid picture he gives of the studies and practice of this worthy. It is drawn with the poet's tolerant humour, but he ends by saying that the doctor loved his gold, and all accounts appear to corroborate this opinion. Quote, "With us there was a doctor of physic. In all this world ne was there known him like, to speak of physic and surgery, for he was grounded in astronomy. He kept his patient a full great deal, in hours by his magic naturel. Well could he fortune the ascendant of his images for the patient. He knew the cause of everych malady, were it of hoot or cold, or moist or dry, and where they engendered and of what humour. He was a very parfait practiseur. The cause he know, and of his harm the root. Anon he hath the sick man his boot. Full ready had he his apothecaries, to send him drugs and his lecheries. For each of hem made other for to win. Here friendship was not new to begin. Well knew he the old Aesculapius, and Dioscorides, and eke Rufus, old Hippocras, Halley, and Gellin, Serapion, Rhasis, and Avicen, Averrois, Damascene, and Constantine, Bernard, and Gateston, and Gilbertin. Of his diet measurable was he, for it was of no superfluity, but of great nourishing and digestible. His study was but little on the Bible. In sanguine and in purse he clad was all, lined with taffeta and with sendal, and yet he was but easy of dispense. He kept that he wan in pestilence. For gold in physic is a cordial, therefore he loved gold in special." End quote. Chaucer here shows great learning and knowledge of the history of medicine. He gives a full list of the Greek and Arab authorities, and also of the men living nearer to his own day. Bernard was Bernardus Gordonius, the professor of medicine at Montpellier in Chaucer's time. Gilbertin was Gilbertus Anglicus, and Gateston was John of Gaddesden. Footnote: Dr. Poore has analyzed the different points in Chaucer's description, and explained the various allusions of the statement that the doctor's line of study had little to do with the Bible. Dr. Poore writes, quote, "This line is frequently quoted to show that the skepticism with which doctors are often charged is of no modern growth. The point of the line is, however, to be found in the fact that Chaucer's doctor was certainly a priest, as were all the physicians of his time, and that the practice of medicine had drawn him away, somewhat unduly perhaps, from the clerical profession to which he also belonged." End quote. End of footnote. Gilbertus Anglicus, author of A Compendium Medicinae, about 1290, is said to have been the first English practical writer on medicine, but as Gilbert quotes a Master Richard, there may have been a still earlier English writer on the subject. The book contains the first description of leprosy written by a European. Little is known of the particulars of his life, but he is said to have been a chancellor at Montpellier. He travelled in the East at the time of the Crusades, probably during the Third Crusade in which Richard I took part. John of Gaddesden, 1280 to 1361, was a doctor of physic of Oxford, graduating from Merton College, Oxford, who subsequently obtained a large practice in London. He was in priest's orders and held a stall in St. Paul's Cathedral. His famous medical treatise entitled Rosa Anglica was written about the year 1305. It treats of fevers and injuries of all parts of the body, and soon became a medical textbook throughout Europe. In his book there is an account of his special treatment of smallpox. He wrote, quote, Let scarlet red be taken, and let him who is suffering smallpox be entirely wrapped in it, or in some other red cloth. I did thus when the son of the illustrious King of England suffered from smallpox. I took care that everything about his couch should be red, and his cure was perfectly effected, for he was restored to health without a trace of the disease." End quote. Gaddesden was court physician to Edward II and Edward III, and seems to have taken advantage of his position to exact high fees. He recommended his contemporaries to make arrangements about payment before undertaking a case. The clergy were forbidden by Pope Innocent III, 1215, to undertake any operation involving the shedding of blood, and subsequently they were forbidden to practice surgery in any form. From this cause the practice of surgery largely came into the hands of the barbers. We shall see later how the profession was divided between the military surgeon and the barber surgeon, but here we have only to deal with the physician. We learn from Riley's Memorials that Roger Clark of Wandsworth was placed in the pillory in May 1382 for pretending to be a physician. He was brought before the mayor and aldermen and charged with deceit and falsehood by Roger at Hash. Quote, "Whereas no physician or surgeon should intermeddle with any medicines or cures within the liberty of the city aforesaid, but those who are experienced in the said arts, and approved therein, the said Roger Clark knew nothing of either of the arts aforesaid, being neither experienced nor approved therein, nor understood anything of letters." End quote. He pretended to heal Roger at Hash's wife Joanna of her bodily infirmities by making her wear an old parchment leaf of a book rolled up in a piece of cloth of gold. This being of no avail, Clark was adjudged to be led, quote, "through the middle of the city with trumpets and pipes, he riding on a horse without a saddle, the said parchment and a whetstone for his lies being hung about his neck." End quote. This man was evidently an impostor and was properly punished for obtaining money under false pretenses. But many of the recipes adopted by the recognized physicians would probably be as ineffectual as the charm of Roger Clark. John de Gaddesden made a disgusting plaster of dung, headless crickets, and beetles, which was rubbed over the sick parts to cure the stone, and we are told in the Rosa Anglica that, quote, "in 3 days the pain had disappeared." End quote. It was very long before the doctors gave up the making of extraordinary plasters and decoctions. Apparently they had the assistance of laymen on occasions. Dr. Furnivall has printed in his edition of Vickery's Anatomy of the Body of Man, 1888, a series of 10 recipes by Henry VIII and his physicians, Dr. Augustin, Dr. Butts, and Dr. Cromer, taken at random from the Sloane manuscript 1047 in the British Museum. Among these are, quote, "the King's Majesty's own plaster, a black plaster devised by the King's Highness, a plaster devised by the King's Majesty at Greenwich and made at Westminster, to take away inflammations and cease pain and heal excoriations, a decoction devised by the King's Majesty, and a cataplasm made ungement-like of the King's Majesty's device made at Westminster." End quote. A conjoint faculty of medicine and surgery was founded in 1423. On the 15th of May, 1423, the mayor and aldermen were petitioned for this purpose. Quote, "The petition prays that all physicians and surgeons practicing in London may be considered as a single body of men, governed by a rector of medicine, with the assistance of 2 surveyors of the faculty of physic and 2 masters of the craft of surgery. There was to be a common place of meeting, consisting of at least 3 separate houses, one fitted with desks for examinations and disputations in philosophy and medicine, as well as for the delivery of lectures. The second house was for the use of the physicians, and the third for the convenience of the surgeons." End quote. The petition was granted, and on the 28th of May, 1423, Master Gilbert Keimer was sworn before the mayor and aldermen as rector of the Faculty of Medicine. Dr. Keimer was a graduate of the University of Oxford and physician to the household of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and also an ecclesiastic. Dr. John Somerset and Dr. Thomas Southwell were sworn on the 27th of September to act as supervisors of physic. The former was also a graduate of Oxford University and a physician to Duke Humphrey. Of the latter's history, Mr. Power could find nothing. There is no record, quote, of the swearing in of a rector of medicine after the 27th of September 1424, nor is there any other indication of the continued existence of a conjoint college after 1425. End quote. Dr. Keimer went to the west of England in 1428 and became Dean of Salisbury in 1449. He continued, however, to practice medicine. Quote, for in June 1455 he was summoned to Windsor to attend Henry VI in the fit of imbecility which attacked him after the first battle of St. Albans. End quote. Little is known of the action of the physicians from 1427 until the College of Physicians was founded by Linacre in 1518. Surgeons. Barbers were of old humble practitioners in the art of surgery and performed minor operations such as bleeding, tooth drawing, and cauterization. They largely assisted the clergy, in whose hands the practice of surgery and medicine was almost wholly confined. The action of the popes, already alluded to, in forbidding the clergy to interfere in any matter connected with the shedding of blood as incompatible with holy office, caused the clergy to devote themselves specially to medicine, and the duties of the barbers were thereby largely extended. Mr. Darcy Power has drawn attention to a matter which is of the greatest interest in the history of the profession, viz., that two types of surgeons flourished side by side in London during the Middle Ages. The military surgeons, who formed the aristocracy of the profession, and the barber surgeons. As early as the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, military surgeons, quote, were in attendance upon the kings and nobles, often in a purely personal capacity, but in the 13th century they had formal gradations of rank and were known as the royal surgeon, the common surgeon, etc. End quote. In 1308, Richard Le Barber, the first master of the Barbers' Guild, who dwelt opposite the Church of All Hallows the Less in Upper Thames Street, was sworn at Guildhall, and in 1310 barbers were appointed to keep strict watch at the city gates, so that no lepers should enter the city. John Ardern was an early surgeon of mark who is worthy of special notice as one of the first English writers on surgery. He had an extensive experience in the treatment of wounds, and it is supposed that at one time he was attached to the English forces during the French wars in the capacity of field surgeon. He was born in 1307 and practiced at Newark from 1349 to 1340, when at the age of 63 years he settled in London. He was specially famous for his treatment of fistula, and he made his great reputation by curing Sir Adam Everingham of this complaint after his case had been pronounced incurable by the chief doctors in France. Ardern had many distinguished patients and received very large fees. In his works, he entered very fully into the history of his cases and his mode of treatment, and when describing the manner of the leech, he throws a remarkable light upon the professional ethics and habits of his time. He was by no means reticent as to the best means of getting over his patients and making them pay well. The surgeon is told to, quote, beware of scarce askings, end quote, and as an example, Ardern says that, if he had to do with, quote, a worthy man and a great, end quote, he charged 100 marks, or £40, for a cure, quote, with robes and fees of 100 shillings term of life by year, end quote. Of less men, he would take £40 or 40 marks without fees, but he adds, quote, never in all my life took I less than 100 shillings for cure of that sickness. End quote. He counsels doctors to be careful in estimating the length of time of a cure, in fact to suggest double the time he expects. If the patient wonders at the rapidity of cure and asks, quote, why that he put him so long a time of curing, sith that he held him by the half, answer he, that it was for that the patient was stony-hearted, and suffered well sharp things, and that he was of good complexion, and had able flesh to hale, and fain he other causes pleaseable to the patient, for patients of such words are proud and delighted. End quote. Ardern's instructions for the guidance of doctors are very sensible, and they help us to form a correct estimate of the manners of the public who are patients. Dr. Poore, after giving an analysis of the surgeon's work, writes, quote, it is evident that John of Ardern was a consummate man of the world, and knew all the tricks of his trade. His fees seem to have been enormous, and indeed he is only one out of many examples among our early professional forerunners who made very large professional incomes. End quote. Mr. Anderson, the biographer of Ardern, remarks that although he called himself, quote, chirurgus intermedicos, there is nothing to show that he possessed a master's degree or any formal license for the exercise of his calling. End quote. Mr. Anderson adds, however, quote, his writings prove that he was a man of clerkly attainments, with a good knowledge of Latin and French, and well read in the available literature of his profession, quoting freely from the works of the medieval surgeons, the Arabs, and even from the Greeks. End quote. Mr. Anderson notes that there are no less than 22 manuscripts of the works of Ardern in the British Museum, both in the original Latin and in early English translations, quote, some repeating or overlapping others in matter. End quote. His book, Da Cura Oculi, is dated from London in 1377. It is not until the next century that a surgeon of equal distinction has arisen in England. There must have been many incompetent practitioners in London in the 14th century, an instance of which evil we find in Riley's Memorials. John Le Spicer of Cornhill in 1354 attended Thomas de Sheen, who suffered from a serious wound in the jaw. Certain surgeons sworn before the mayor found that, quote, enormous and horrible hurt on the right side of the jaw of Thomas de Sheen, end quote, was incurable, but they held that if John Le Spicer had been expert in his craft, or had called in counsel and assistance to his aid, the injury might have been cured. When the charter was granted to the Barbers' Company in the next century, it is expressly stated in the preamble, 1462, that through, quote, the ignorance, negligence, and stupidity, end quote, of various barbers and other practitioners in surgery, many of the king's lieges had, quote, gone the way of all flesh. End quote. Mr. Darcy Power states that, quote, a guild of surgeons, distinct from the guild of barbers, existed in London from time immemorial. The guild was always a small body, probably never more than 20 in number, and sometimes dwindling to less than a dozen. It existed and remained unincorporated at a time when many of the other guilds either vanished or were converted into companies. The earliest notice of the Surgeons' Guild occurs in 1369. End quote. This information is obtained from Letter Book G, translated from the Latin by Riley. Quote, on Monday next, after the feast of the Purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary, 2nd of February, 1369, Master John Dunhewed, Master John Hinstoke, and Nicholas Kildsby, surgeons, were admitted in full husting before Simon de Morden, mayor, and the alderman, and sworn, as master surgeons of the city, that they would well and faithfully serve the people in undertaking their cures, would take reasonably from them, would faithfully follow their calling, and would present to the said mayor and alderman the defaults of others undertaking cures, so often as should be necessary, and that they would be ready at all times, when they should be warned, to attend the maimed or wounded, and other persons, and would give truthful information to the officers of the city aforesaid, as to such maimed, wounded, and others, whether they be in peril of death or not, and also faithfully to do all things touching their calling." End quote. There is a similar ordinance dated April 1390, in which Master John Hinstock, Master Geoffrey Grace, Master John Bradmore, and Master Henry Sutton, surgeons, were admitted and sworn before the mayor. Mr. Power points out that this ordinance is specially interesting because the inspecting master surgeons are sworn, quote, "faithfully to follow their calling, and faithful scrutiny to make of others, both men and women, undertaking cures or practicing the art of surgery, and to present their defaults, as well in their practice as in their medicine, to the aforesaid mayor and aldermen, so often as need shall be." End quote. Mr. Powers says, quote, "The officers thus put under an obligation to perform certain public duties were the masters or aldermen of the Surgeons' Guild, and it is certain that they took so wide a view of their duties as to harass the members of the Barbers' Guild who meddled with surgery. Thus, in 1410, certain good and honest folk, barbers of the city, appeared by their counsel in the private chamber of the aldermen and sheriffs, and demanded that they should for ever peaceably enjoy their privileges, without scrutiny of any person of other craft or trade than barbers, and this neither in shaving, cupping, bleeding, nor any other thing in any way pertaining to Barbary, or to such practice of surgery as is now used, or in future to be used, within the craft of the said barbers." End quote. In 1417 there is in the city records special reference to the wardens of the faculty or craft of surgeons. Security was given by a surgeon to the chamberlain of the city to ensure due care of his patients. John Severall Love, surgeon, undertook to pay £20 sterling to the chamberlain if he, quote, "should take any man under his care, as to whom risk of maiming or of his life might ensue, and within 4 days should not warn the wardens of the craft of surgery thereof." End quote. Half of this sum was to go to the city, and the other half to the faculty of surgeons. We now arrive at the time when another great surgeon arose. This was Thomas Morstead, surgeon to Henry V and Henry VI, and probably previously to Henry IV, who, Mr. Power says, made the first serious attempt to convert surgery into a profession. When Henry V, in the spring of 1415, entered on his campaign in France, which ended with the victory at Agincourt on the 25th of October, the medical arrangements of the army were very complete. Quote, "The agreement, dated the 29th of April, 1415, is to the effect that Nicholas Colnet was to accompany the king for a year as physician to the forces in Guienne and France. He was to be attended by 3 archers as a guard, each archer receiving 6d. a day, whilst Colnet drew 12d. for his own pay. Thomas Morstead, the surgeon, had also 3 archers assigned to him for protection, and he too received 12d. a day, in addition to the usual allowance of 100 marks a quarter, the pay, it is stated, for 30 men-at-arms, with a share of the plunder. Morstead was directed further to take with him 12 of his own craft, each subordinate surgeon to receive the pay of an archer, 6d. a day. The scale of pay here granted is very liberal. The ordinary day's wage of a labourer at this time was 1 penny. Each archer and each surgeon was considered to be worth the wages of 6 day labourers, and the 2 chiefs double their assistants. Yet in spite of these attractions, the service was a perilous one, even though it only lasted a few months. Morstead engaged William Bradwardine to act under him, but he had such difficulty in securing the services of the 12 assistants that he prayed the king to grant his letters of privy seal directed to your Chancellor of England, to cause him to deliver to your suppliant letters of commission under your great seal, by force of which he should have power to press 12 persons of his craft, such as he should choose, to accompany him, and to serve your most gracious sovereign lord during your campaign. Morstead became a rich and influential London citizen, and served as sheriff in 1436. He died in 1450, and was buried in the church of St. Olav Upwell, Old Jewry, where he had built a fair new aisle. End quote. Footnote: William Hobbs, appointed in 1461, was the first sergeant surgeon, a distinguished office which carried with it certain well-defined professional privileges. Thomas Morstead, William Bradwardine, and John Harwer, who attended Henry V in his French campaigns, did not receive this title, but are called simply surgeons to the king. End of footnote. Dr. Furnivall printed in his edition of Thomas Vickery's Anatomy of the Body of Man a paper from a manuscript in the British Museum containing a statement of the pay of navy surgeons in the reign of Henry VIII. The Henry Grace de Dieu carried 2 surgeons at 23 shillings and 4pence a month. Also, the Mary Rose and the Great Galley, with 2 surgeons each at the same pay, and 19 other vessels, each with 1 surgeon at 10 shillings a month. To return to the Fellowship of Surgeons, Mr. Power tells us that in 1435 the surgeons, then 17 in number, became an established body, with a code of laws and regulations which still exist in a small vellum volume now preserved in Barber's Hall. In 1462 they obtained a charter of incorporation, and in 1492 were given a grant of arms. In 1493 the Guild, quote, was living on friendly terms with the Barbers' Company, for in this year the 2 guilds entered into a composition, dated the 12th of May, and signed by representatives of both bodies. This composition recognized the independence of the 2 fellowships, of surgeons enfranchised within the City of London, and of barber surgeons and surgeon barbers enfranchised in the said city. It was agreed that neither body should admit any one except a regular apprentice to practice surgery without the consent and knowledge of the other, and to ensure this being carried into effect, every stranger seeking a license to practice in London was to be presented to the mayor by the 4 wardens of the 2 guilds. End quote. The end of the Fellowship of Surgeons came in 1540, when it was united by Act of Parliament, 32 Henry VIII, with the Company of Barbers. The granting of the charter on this occasion was the cause of Holbein's famous picture being painted. This picture still decorates the Barber's Hall in Monkwell Street. Allusion has already been made to the Barbers' Company, to its first master in 1308, and to its incorporation by royal charter in 1462 by Edward IV. In 1376, the Guild elected 2 masters, and at this time the members were sharply divided between the barbers proper and the barbers exercising the faculty of surgery. In 1390, 4 masters were sworn in 1 year, but these were really only master and wardens, as stated by Mr. Young in his most valuable and exhaustive account of the Barber Surgeons' Company. The relative positions of the city companies has frequently changed. Thus, at one time the barber surgeons were entitled to the 17th place, but in 1516 they only ranked as the 28th. In 1537, the barber surgeons formed the most numerous company in London, the number of freemen being 185. The next in order of numbers was the skinners, with 151, then the haberdashers with 120, the leather sellers with 113, and the fishmongers with 109. The rest of the companies numbered less than 100, the bowyers being the lowest with 19. In 1745, the surgeons, who had long chafed under the inconveniences caused by official connection with the barbers, seceded and formed the Surgeons' Company, under the title of the Masters, Governors, and Commonalty of the Art and Science of Surgery, which was established by Act of Parliament. The surgeons found a temporary home at the Stationers' Hall until 1751, when the premises known as Surgeons' Hall in the Old Bailey were ready for occupation. The company came to a premature end in 1796, and it was not until 1800 that the Royal College of Surgeons was established. End of Chapter 7, Part 1. End of Section 11.